Adrian noticed it on an ordinary Tuesday night with nothing about the evening to suggest it would become the kind of moment that divides time into before and after. No fight building in the background of the day that might have sharpened his attention toward the small things. No accumulated tension looking for somewhere to land. Just an ordinary evening in the apartment they shared, the kind that had become the texture of their life together, without either of them deciding that ordinary was what they were settling into. Lena called from the kitchen asking if he wanted tea, and she used his name the way people use names when they are directing a question at someone specific, and Adrian heard something in the two syllables of it that stopped him in a way he couldn't immediately account for. There had once been something inside the way she said his name that he had never consciously noticed until it was no longer there. A warmth that lived in the particular way she formed the word. A recognition that made even the most ordinary utterance of it feel like something more than identification. Something soft and specific that communicated without meaning to that the person being addressed was known and held in a way that went past the simple fact of knowing someone's name. What he heard on the Tuesday night was different from that in a way that was almost impossible to describe with any precision, because the difference wasn't in anything that could be pointed to directly. It was careful, neutral in a way that names between two people who have been close for years are not usually neutral, almost formal, carrying the particular quality of words that have been lightly handled, that have had some of their intimacy quietly removed without any announcement being made about the removal. The moment passed quickly enough that he could have chosen to let it pass entirely, could have filed it in the category of things imagined or misread, and returned his attention to whatever it had been on before Lena's voice came from the kitchen. But he didn't. He sat with it instead, turned it over with the careful attention of someone who has heard something they can't quite place and needs to understand why it has lodged itself so firmly in their awareness. And sitting with it, he discovered something that unsettled him in a way that the ordinary Tuesday evening had given him no preparation for. He missed her, missed the version of her that had said his name the other way, the way that made him feel recognized rather than simply identified. Missed something that had apparently been leaving for long enough that its absence was now audible, and he had not noticed the leaving while it was happening. She was standing in the next room, and he missed her already. The relationship had not collapsed in any of the ways that collapse is usually described, with the force and the noise and the single identifiable moment that everything can be traced back to afterward. It had thinned, gradually and without drama, and in the small and individually unremarkable ways that thinning happens when two people are busy living alongside each other, and neither of them is paying close enough attention to what is quietly leaving the space between them. They ate dinner together most evenings, and both of them looked at their phones during the silences that used to be filled with the easy conversation of two people who were genuinely interested in the details of each other's days. The phones had appeared gradually, first as an occasional thing and then as a habit, and then as something neither of them thought to comment on anymore. They apologized quickly when friction arose, too quickly, with the efficiency of people who have learned that a fast apology ends the discomfort faster than an honest conversation would, even when the honest conversation is the thing that would actually address what produced the friction in the first place. They slept beside each other every night, and the physical closeness had become a fact of their shared life, rather than a choice either of them was making with any awareness of making it. The touching that had once been natural and unthought had become something that required a small decision neither of them was consistently making. The conversations between them had become logistical, in the way that conversations become logistical when the emotional layer of a relationship has receded enough that what remains is the practical management of a shared life. Who was handling what needed to be done, the information required to coordinate two people living in the same space. Neither of them was being cruel to the other. Neither had decided to withdraw or made a conscious choice to stop investing in what they had. They were simply becoming emotionally unreachable to each other in the quiet, incremental way that happens when two people stop turning toward each other in the small moments, and the habit of turning away compounds into something that eventually feels like the natural state of things. Nothing between them felt broken enough to name as a crisis that required immediate attention. but nothing felt alive enough to justify the kind of investment that keeping something alive requires from the people inside it. Lena looked at him sometimes, with an expression he had begun to recognize without being able to describe, the look of someone trying to locate a feeling they remember having in a place where they used to reliably find it. On a rainy night when the apartment was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when both of them were present and neither of them was speaking, Lena asked him a question that had clearly been forming for longer than the evening. She asked if he ever felt lonely with her, and the way she asked it contained nothing accusatory or aggressive, just the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a question for too long and has finally run out of reasons to keep carrying it alone. Adrian opened his mouth to answer and discovered that honesty had become difficult in a way it hadn't always been between them, that the true answer had been accumulating for long enough that finding the beginning of it was harder than it should have been. He told her he missed her even when he was sitting right beside her, and the sentence changed the quality of the air in the room in the immediate and irreversible way that true things do when they are finally said out loud after a long period of being held in silence. They sat with what he had said, and both of them understood what it meant, and what it was confirming about something they had each been aware of in their own way for longer than either had been willing to make official by speaking it aloud. The love was still present. That was the specific cruelty of the moment, the thing that made it harder rather than easier. They hadn't arrived at this conversation through the absence of feeling, but through the presence of feeling without the ability to reach each other through it anymore. Love had stayed longer than connection had remained in the apartment with them after the ease of reaching each other had quietly left, sitting in the rooms like something that couldn't find its way out, but also couldn't do what it used to do when everything else that surrounded it had still been intact. Something irreversible had been spoken into the room between them, and the silence that followed it held the weight of two people understanding simultaneously that they had passed a point they couldn't return from. Lena packed on a gray Saturday afternoon, with the quiet and considered movements of someone who had been preparing for this in the private spaces of herself for long enough that the actual doing of it had a quality of completion rather than crisis. She folded clothes with a calm precision that Adrian watched from the doorway without speaking, recognizing in the carefulness of her movements the evidence of how long she had been ready for this, without his knowing that she had arrived there. Rain moved against the windows. The shelves in the room held the gaps that her things had left behind them. A coffee he had made earlier sat on the counter, growing cold in the way that coffee grows cold when the moment it was made for has passed. There was no screaming and no final argument assembled from all the unaddressed things of the preceding months. No confrontation that gave the ending the noise that endings sometimes need to feel real to the people inside them. Just two people being gentle with each other all the way to the conclusion of something that had once been the most important thing in both of their lives, treating the ending with a care they had perhaps not always managed to give to the middle of it. The hardest part of all of it was the gentleness. The absence of cruelty made the absence of everything else more present rather than less, made it impossible to locate the ending in any single failure or wound, and required both of them to sit with the more honest and more difficult explanation. The apartment door closed with the quiet sound of a door closing, and Adrian stood in the space that had been theirs and was now simply his, and listened to the silence that came after it. He sat in the apartment for a long time after the sound of the door had finished moving through the rooms, not reaching for anything to fill the silence with, just sitting inside what had happened and letting the understanding of it arrive at whatever pace it needed. Relationships he was coming to understand with the particular clarity that comes from being inside the aftermath of one, rarely end from a single catastrophic moment that arrives without warning and breaks everything at once. They end from the accumulation of smaller absences, conversations that were avoided when having them would have cost something real, vulnerability that was withheld in the moments when offering it would have required more than felt safe to give. The gradual and almost imperceptible decrease in the effort of turning toward each other that compounds over time into a distance neither person intended to create but both participated in creating. The ending had begun, he understood now, not in any of the moments that had felt significant while they were happening, not in the silences or the shortened conversations, or even in the question Lena had finally asked on the rainy night. It had begun in the accumulated small moments when both of them had turned away from each other instead of toward each other, when the easier path had been chosen over the honest one often enough that the habit of choosing it had become the architecture of what they were. He sat with that understanding and let it be what it was without reaching for anything to soften it. And then he thought about the Tuesday night and the kitchen and the 2 syllables of his name said, in a voice that had already begun its quiet withdrawal from everything that had once lived inside the saying of it. He had thought, in the abstract way that people think about heartbreak before they have experienced the specific version of it that belongs to them, that it would arrive with the force and the noise of something catastrophic, that he would know it immediately and completely by the scale of what it felt like when it landed. But theirs had arrived quietly, over a long time, and in increments too small to feel significant on their own, building into something enormous from components that had each seemed dismissible when they were happening. It had arrived in the way she started saying his name, like it belonged to someone she used to know.